Buenos dias and welcome to my first ever video blog. Just to tell you a bit about myself, my name's Duncan and I'm a British freelance journalist based in Guadalajara, Mexico's second biggest city. I mainly work for Vice News, Al Jazeera, The Independent and occasionally The Guardian. And I mainly focus on organised crime and the war on drugs, Mexican politics, social movements, human rights, and the occasional cultural story, a bit of food or business and sport as well, a bit of everything really. But what I'm planning to do with this video blog is to focus on one different issue facing Mexico each week, and maybe bring on different experts in their fields who can discuss these topics, and so you're not just listening to me each week. Now, what I'm going to do this first week is discuss one of the issues, one of the most common questions that I get from people when I tell them I live in Mexico, in Guadalajara. And that question is, what's the security situation like there? How dangerous is it? Is it safe to visit or to live or to work or do business? So the first thing I would say is it's a fantastic city. It's got an amazing culture, great people, really friendly people, fantastic weather all year round. Amazing food, lots of great cafes, bars and restaurants, and on the cultural side it's the home of tequila, mariachi music, so there's a lot of really cool Mexican traditions here. So I think it is important to say that it's a fantastic place to live. I love it here. I've been here nearly 6 years now, so I wouldn't live here if I didn't like it. Now on the security side, generally it's fine. Like, you walk around in the daytime, absolutely fine, no problems. It's mostly just a case of having common sense, stay out of bad neighbourhoods, don't walk alone at night, etc. There is some petty crime, but nothing that you wouldn't get in any other big city anywhere else in the world. And sometimes you might just be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I think it is important to acknowledge that some people are more vulnerable than others. A lot of abductions and enforced disappearances tend to occur in more working class neighbourhoods, or a lot of young girls, young women are often targeted as well. So there are bigger risks depending on your personal situation. And then in terms of like the more serious level of crime, now that's a different kind of issue. It doesn't necessarily affect your daily life, but it is important to acknowledge what goes on here, and there has been a very strong level of a strong presence of organised crime here in Guadalajara over the last 40 years or so. That began really in the late 1970s, early 1980s, when a bunch of Sinaloan drug traffickers moved down to Guadalajara and formed the Guadalajara Cartel, which became Mexico's most dominant cartel at this time. That lasted until the mid-1980s, when they decided to abduct and torture and murder an undercover DEA agent called Enrique Camarena, which led to the biggest investigation in DEA history, and the capture and imprisonment of many of the leaders of the Guadalajara cartel. Now, out of that sprang the Sinaloa cartel, which kind of became the next biggest drug trafficking organization throughout the 1990s, the 2000s, up until today. So the best known leader of the Sinaloa cartel was obviously Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. But you've also got people like El Mayo and El Azul, who all kind of started out in the Guadalajara cartel and then went on to dominate the Mexican drug trade over the next couple of decades. Here in Guadalajara, it was in this time, the 1990s, the early 2000s, it became known as a kind of neutral zone, because you had a lot of the families of all the different drug cartel leaders. A lot of them came to live here, so it was kind of considered an area where you don't go after people's rivals' families, that kind of thing. But the actual drug trade here in Guadalajara was mainly controlled by a guy called Nacho Coronel, who was another member of the Sinaloa cartel. He was known as the king of the crystal meth trade, but he was shot dead in a military raid on his home in Guadalajara in 2010. And then since then, you had a group of his followers broke off and started their own cartel called the Jalisco Generation Cartel, which was also made up of former members of the Millennial Cartel run by the Valencia brothers, who were from the neighboring state of Michoacan, but also operated here in Guadalajara and in Jalisco state. So the new Generation Cartel, it started out as a kind of offshoot of this Sinaloa cartel. It was like an armed wing that they would send to attack rivals like Los Zetas in Veracruz. But they kept a fairly low profile at first. It started out about five years ago. But in the last year or two, they've started to become a lot more aggressive. They've been carrying out paramilitary-style attacks. They've been ambushing federal and state police patrols, killing dozens of police officers. They assassinated the Jalisco state tourism secretary 3 years ago. They abducted and murdered a federal congressman a couple of years ago. And then last year was when it really began to kick off, when they started attacking these police patrols. So the federal government decided to make it a priority, and they launched Operation Jalisco on the 1st of May last year, which was aimed at capturing the cartel leader, a guy called El Mencho. But the cartel responded by shooting down a military helicopter on this day, which is completely unprecedented. It's the first time that a helicopter's been shot down in the history of the Mexican drug war. They also burned something like 37 buses all across Guadalajara and the Jalisco area to kind of block off roads and help the cartel operatives to escape. They torched banks and gas stations as well. And it was kind of like a message to the authorities to back off, otherwise they'll just keep creating this kind of chaos here in the state. Now, this kind of direct confrontation has kind of eased off a little bit in the last year. There's been a lot of arrests of El Mencho's family members and lieutenants, but he's still out there somewhere. He's still evading arrest, but there hasn't been so much kind of high-level violence. But there have still been continuous attacks on police officers here in Guadalajara, and attacks against local mayors and that kind of thing in other small towns across Jalisco. And I think it is fair to say that the security situation in the city of Guadalajara and the state of Jalisco has deteriorated significantly since I've been here. Last year, we've seen there were more cases of extortion reported in Jalisco last year than in any other state in Mexico. The number of people who have disappeared here was over 2,200 people missing just in this one state, which is at least the fourth highest total in Mexico. Some people, if you speak to local experts here, they'll say the actual number of people who have disappeared is significantly higher than the official statistics indicate. The level of violence against women has really worryingly increased. The number of feminicides, the murder of women, has skyrocketed in the last 5 years. The number of abductions in recent weeks, there's been a lot of cases of people trying to abduct young women, kind of late teens, early 20s, just on the street, and pull them into a car and drive off. I've spoken to 2 girls who managed to escape from similar cases, and the authorities here, originally they tried to dismiss these reports. They said they were just rumours, but they've now accepted that in the last few weeks there have been a number of cases which they are now formally investigating. So there has been a kind of worrying rise in the level of violence, and in many cases it's not just cartel-on-cartel violence anymore. There are normal people that are being extorted or kidnapped and that kind of thing. So that has become a real concern now. So I guess the question is, well, why is this happening? So Jalisco state has always been a fairly important strategic place in the drug trade. There's a lot of marijuana plantations here in Jalisco. There's a lot of meth labs. There's some opium plantations near the town of Tequila and the area close to the neighboring state of Nayarit, which is a major heroin-producing area, as the journalist Sam Quiñones explains in his excellent book Dreamland, which explains the heroin epidemic that we've seen in the US over the last 20 years. In Colima, which is a state just south of Jalisco, you've got the biggest port, one of the biggest ports in Mexico, which is a major point of entrance for the precursor chemicals that are used in the production of methamphetamine. And you've now got several different cartels fighting for control of that port because it's a hugely important kind of strategic point in the drug trade. So what we don't really know at the moment, no one seems to be quite sure precisely what the relationship is between the Jalisco New Generation Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel. There's been a lot of talk about them fighting each other in Tijuana at the moment. They say the Jalisco cartel's moved in there to challenge the Sinaloa cartel. Recently there's been talk of that they're fighting each other in Colima as well. And there doesn't appear to be an out-and-out war, at least here in Jalisco at the moment, but I have heard that the situation's also getting worse in Nayarit, which is the buffer state really between Sinaloa and Jalisco. So I guess that's kind of possibly become the new front line of the conflict between these two cartels. So there may not be an out-and-out war exactly at the moment. It may just be kind of local cells fighting each other, but there's definitely a sense that there are growing tensions there. Now, the government has tried to kind of prioritize, or at least in the last year, they said they were going to prioritize Jalisco, but then after El Chapo escaped, it kind of took the heat off this area, and the government's focus was drawn back to Sinaloa again. So now it seems that things are kind of steadily getting worse here in Jalisco again. But I do think there's a big difference between talking about what's happening here in Guadalajara and what's happening in some of these small towns in Jalisco. I think Guadalajara is kind of considered too important economically and politically to let it become like a failed state, to get that kind of level of violence that we've seen in other parts of the country, in Guerrero, Michoacán, Tamaulipas, or even the kind of level of violence that began to affect Monterrey about 5 years ago, which is another big economic hub for Mexico. But Guadalajara tries to sell itself as Mexico's Silicon Valley and a big place for investment for US investors. So I don't think the authorities will let the situation get much worse here in the city at least. But if you go to some of these towns like Ocotlan, or you speak to people from Tala or Lagos de Moreno or El Grullo, I think the situation there is completely different. It's a lot more desperate. It sounds like the authorities have basically lost control of some of these towns. You hear stories of mass disappearances of local residents. Even politicians, they say they're scared to go back to some of their homes in places like towns like El Grullo, which is considered a bastion of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. So I think there needs to be a lot more done to kind of secure not just Guadalajara, but these other towns in other parts of the state. Otherwise, there is a real risk that these areas are going to come to resemble what we've seen in Michoacán and Guerrero and Tamaulipas, these kind of places that are really considered to be failed states now. That's all I really had in mind to talk about today. But if you have any comments or questions or criticism, preferably constructive criticism, then you can leave a comment below. As you can probably tell, I'm pretty new to this video blogging thing, but hopefully once I've had a bit of practice, I'll get it looking and sounding a bit more professional. And like I said, we'll get some interesting guests on, hopefully in the next few weeks. In the meantime, if you're interested in Mexican politics, or Mexican news in general, any of these topics I'm talking about, you can give me a follow on Twitter, where I'm at Duncan Tucker. Or if you want to have a look at any of my articles, you can visit my website, thetequilafiles.com, where I post links to all my latest articles. So yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll try to do another one of these again soon.